Hey everyone, so this is a video on the hero's journey vis-a-vis Joseph Campbell and the Monomyth. If you're in high school, you're probably going to be reading excerpts of Homer's Odyssey, but that text is pretty long and it can be a little confusing to remember all the parts. So what I thought I would do is we would look at the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell's Monomyth against Star Wars, because almost everybody knows the story backwards and forward, forward and backwards. So it makes it a little easier to understand the stages if we can connect it to the stages in this movie. You can basically do this with any hero's journey, but as I said, Star Wars is pretty well known. And Joseph Campbell, you may or may not hear that name, but a lot of the stages of the hero's journey that you're going to talk about in high school, for example, when you're looking at the Odyssey, come from Joseph Campbell. So that's a picture of him there. He wrote a couple of great books. I really recommend you read them if you're interested in mythology at all. One is The Power of Myth, and the other is The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And actually, George Lucas read those books, and he basically read them and then wrote Star Wars. And that's why Star Wars syncs up so well with these books, and that's why I decided to use it as an example of what Joseph Campbell was trying to talk about. Okay, so what exactly is the monomyth? Campbell describes 17 stages or steps along the hero's journey, and very few myths contain all 17 stages, but what Joseph Campbell was he was basically a professor of mythology, so he had studied all the myths that he could come across, and he was able to identify in all of them about 17 stages. Some have a lot of the stages, some have only a few, but almost every myth you're going to find is going to have at least some of the stages Campbell discovered or describes. And he breaks them into three major parts. The first is departure or separation, and this is almost always at the beginning of the myth, and it deals with the hero's adventure prior to the quest, or their situation prior to the quest. Then you've got initiation, and it deals with the hero's many adventures along the way. And then you've got return. So it's sort of a circle. There's the hero leaves their home. That's the departure, separation from what they know. There's the initiation, which is they become the hero by going through trials and adventures. And then usually they circle back in some way, and that's the return. And they usually have some kind of knowledge or power that they acquired on the journey. So Odysseus, for example, leaves, goes to fight the Trojan Wars, has lots of adventures, comes back, things aren't the way they were when he left it. You know, it's that old thing, you can never go home again, I suppose. So here's sort of there's a lot more stages, as I said, but this is an easy one. So at the top you've got known, that's the hero's home, if you will, and at the start there's the call to adventure. There's usually some kind of supernatural aid, and then they cross a threshold, and we're going to talk about this. When they cross the threshold, they move into the unknown, and then lots of things happen to them. There's usually some kind of mentor, there's helpers, there's challenges, temptations. There's usually some kind of climax there at the bottom, abyss. Something really big happens to them. They have some kind of revelation. There's a transformation that follows. There's maybe some kind of atonement. And then in the return phase, they come back to the known. So this will make a little more sense when we look at Star Wars. Okay, so basically, in a monomyth, the hero begins in the ordinary world and receives a call to enter into an unknown world of strange powers and events. The hero who accepts the call, and not all of them do, to enter this strange world must face tasks and trials, either alone or with assistance, usually with assistance. In the most intense versions of the narrative, the hero must survive a severe challenge, often with help. If the hero survives, the hero may achieve a great gift or boon. Boon is just kind of an old word for quality or gift. The hero must then decide whether to return to the ordinary world with this boon. If the hero decides to return, he or she often faces challenges on the return journey. If the hero returns successfully, the boon or gift may be used to improve the world. The stories of Osiris, Prometheus, Moses, Buddha, for example, follow this structure closely. So just taking Buddha, for example, Siddhartha, he lives in a palace, he decides to seek enlightenment, he goes out, so he accepts the call. He could have stayed at home, and he could have rejected the call. He faced tasks and trials. That's when he achieves enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and he ends up having his meditation where he becomes enlightened, and there's actually some trials that I don't want to get into it too much, but there's some trials that go with that. But then he returns and he brings this thing that he learned, and he makes the world a better place with it. You can look at Odysseus, for example, in that same way. Osiris, the Egyptian god, Moses, etc. You get the idea. So let's look at Star Wars. The first stage is the call to adventure. The hero starts off in a mundane situation of normality from which some information is received that acts as a call to head off into the unknown. So in this case, you've got, in the beginning of the movie, you got Luke Skywalker. He's living on Tatooine. He's a farmer. Sort of nothing's going on. He even complains at the beginning that nothing's happening. He wants to leave. He's in this really mundane situation. And he ends up getting this message from R2-D2, which is Princess Leia. It's the classic princess in distress, and that's his call to adventure. But before he can either accept it or he can refuse it. So at first he refuses it, and refusing comes when the hero usually is forced into refusing it, and this may be from a sense of duty or obligation, fear, insecurity, a sense of inadequacy, or anything that holds the person in his or her current circumstance. So in the movie, Luke wants to break free, but his Uncle Owen, tells him that he has to stay and work on the farm. He has an obligation to the family. So notice, for example, that these are a little bit out of order. No story follows the Monomyth in any particular sequence, but the stages are all there. So you've got this sort of this parental block in the form of Uncle Owen. But ultimately, Luke does answer the call, because what happens? The stormtroopers destroy his home, and that's what motivates him to accept the call and go with Obi-Wan Kenobi off planet. So that's when we get into supernatural aid. Once the hero has committed to the quest, either consciously or unconsciously, his or her guide or magical helper appears or becomes known. Remember when Luke met Obi-Wan, he didn't really know who he was. He didn't know he was a magical helper, if you will. He didn't know he was a Jedi. He just thought he was an old man. But then it becomes known what he is when he tells him that he's a Jedi and that he has to leave with him. And often in myth, the magical helper will give some kind of talisman or artifact to the hero. So think of like the Golden Fleece in Jason and the Argonauts, or in this case, I think we could even say it's the lightsaber. It's a talisman or artifact that will aid them in their quest. Then we've got crossing the threshold. So this is the point where the person actually crosses into the field of adventure, leaving the known limits of his or her world and venturing into an unknown and dangerous realm where the rules and limits are not known. So essentially, Mos Eisley Spaceport is the threshold. And almost all myths, there will be some place where the hero has to go, and by going there, they're sort of stepping over a line. And on the other side of that line is a whole lot of things that they're not sure about. And usually at the threshold, there will be things called threshold guardians. And in Star Wars, it would probably be the people in the bar. So he gets in that fight at the bar, if you remember, where he uses the lightsaber to cut off someone's arm. That would be an example of a threshold guardian. It's someone trying to prevent him from crossing the threshold. I'm remembering in Dante's Inferno, there's a demon guarding the river Styx, and it's got the tails. I can't remember its name now, but that would be a threshold guardian. Dante has to get across the river Styx to go to the underworld, to go to the Inferno, and he can't get across because of this demon, so that's a threshold guardian. But anyway, so the hero has to cross the threshold, and in this case, it would be Mos Eisley. Then there's initiation. This is sort of the second stage of the whole thing, and it usually starts at the belly of the whale. That's what Campbell called it. This stage represents the final separation from the hero's known world and self. And by entering this stage, the person shows a willingness to undergo a metamorphosis. So in the case of Star Wars, you can almost exactly, they get pulled into the Death Star. It's this big thing. They get sucked in. They can't get out. Think Jonah and the whale. That's where Belly of the Whale comes from. You get pulled into this place. You can't get out of it, and you have to undergo some kind of change while you're in there in order to get out of it. So Jonah had to realize the mistake he had made before he could get out of the whale. In this case, they get pulled into the Death Star, and they have to become something that they're not. They have to become that hero to get out again. Meeting with the goddess, usually in a myth, there's going to be some kind of hero or character. There's going to be some kind of character that the hero meets of some kind of special beauty or power. So, in this case, Princess Leia, right? I think enough said. And then here's a few more quick. There's usually a dragon battle. In this case, we could call it the trash compactor monster. There's usually a ritual death. This would be, in the case of Star Wars, the death of Obi-Wan. There's what's called a sacred marriage, and don't get tripped up on the marriage word. It's usually just a bond with somebody. So in this case, the sacred marriage was Luke Skywalker developed a bond with Obi-Wan Kenobi. And there's an atonement or at one with a recognition of the Father. In this case, I know you're thinking Darth Vader, but in this case, in this story, I know it's Star Wars as a whole. Darth Vader is his father, but if you just kind of look at, that's the macrocosm of Star Wars. If you look at the microcosm of this particular movie, Obi-Wan is really the father to Luke. And when Obi-Wan returns as an internalized voice when he tells Luke to run, that's the atonement or recognition of the father. Then there's this kind of a big one, apotheosis. I'll say that again, apotheosis. That's how it's pronounced. It's a deification. It's when the hero achieves some kind of godlike quality or status. It's a point in the story where the hero is held up as an ideal. So to me, it seemed like when Luke swung across the chasm with Leia, that seemed like a kind of a heroic thing to do. It seemed like he had really achieved the mark of hero at that point. So that was his apotheosis. And here's a few more. Ultimate boon. That's the Death Star plans. Usually the hero gets, as I mentioned before, some kind of ultimate boon, something they had to go this long distance to get, and then they have to bring it back and do something with it. So in this case, it was the Death Star plans. There's the magic flight or pursuit. This is once they have the ultimate boon. In the case of the movie, Darth Vader chases Luke down the Death Star trench. That I would say would be the magic flight pursuit stage. And then there's crossing the return threshold. So that's when the hero comes back. So think of when Odysseus comes back to his kingdom, and everything's a little bit different. But that's the return threshold. He left, something happened to him, he gained something, he's a different person, and he has to come back. And in some ways, it's difficult to cross the threshold again because it's almost never the same. But in the case of the movie, I would say when the Death Star is destroyed and Luke returns with his companions, that would be crossing the return threshold. And then finally, you've got Master of Two Worlds. And this is the end of almost all myths. The hero has achieved a balance between the material and the spiritual. The person has become comfortable and competent in both the inner and outer worlds. What does that mean? Well, think about the Buddha. Just going back to the myth I had mentioned before. You know what I mean by myth. He has to become competent to deal with what he's realized internally, but he still is alive in the world, and he has to deal with the outer world. Luke Skywalker has realized who he is to some degree. Of course, he hasn't realized it all because the movie goes on. It's more than just this one, but in the scope of this movie, he has sort of achieved something. He's realized who he is, but he still has challenges he has to face. So that's the outer world. But he's achieved some kind of balance. And so I would say that medal ceremony at the end would be the stage of the Master of Two Worlds. So that's basically it. That's the hero's journey, according to Joseph Campbell, against Star Wars. And as I said, it's almost always used against Odysseus and the Odyssey, but and it can be kind of confusing because of that, because it's such a long story and so many things happen. And there's like lots of little circles within the big circle, if you know what I mean by that. There's lots of little myth cycles within the large myth cycle when you're looking at the Odyssey. So I hope that looking at it against Star Wars was helpful. And you can do this against almost any movie. So thumbs up if you like that. Happy to answer any questions. Thanks.